Swine It. It's time for a new era of communication in the swine industry. One that you can get the latest updates while commuting or driving to farms. Here you have the brightest minds of the global swine industry in your pocket.
Yeah, that's one thing that's different today than it was 30 or 40 years ago, is that used to be we would send a paper copy of the formula to the feed mill. And there was a guy at the feed mill, usually one of the more experienced guys, that would enter that new formula. And if he saw something different, he'd call you and ask about it. And that was a good thing. And I want to tell you that if someone calls you and questions a formula, even if there's nothing wrong with it, you should thank them profusely.
Welcome to Swine It Podcast. My name is Marcio Gonçalves, your host for today's episode. Yeah, thanks, Wayne, for your time.
You bet.
I appreciate it.
Yep.
So, Wayne, there is, a lot of everyone knows you in the U.S. and North America. I want you to give us a little bit of your history. Just like how did you end up in swine nutrition and tell us what you do.
Well, I grew up on a pig farm. My father was a good hog man, and my earliest recollection as a child is coming out, waking up in the morning and coming out in the kitchen and father warming up a box full of baby pigs by the stove. You know, they'd been born on a cold Nebraska night, and he brought them in to warm them up. So I attended the University of Nebraska. Back in those days, I didn't know you were supposed to think about different colleges. I just went to the one that was closest. Mm-hmm. So then as a university student, I worked part-time at the pig farm, the genetics and reproductive physiology research farm. What I do today is I have 6 customers I formulate diets for and help them with their nutrition, and they're really nice people. And one thing I like about them is that they are people that have done every job on the farm, Right. So they have some compassion and appreciation for the pig and the people taking care of the pig. I work part-time for PIC, and there's been some real positive parts to that. Weasley Orlando that I get to work with, he has experience from a whole nother continent, that I don't have, and he has some really good computer skills that I don't have, and modeling skills. So that's been good for me. Yeah.
Very nice.
To have access to those tools.
Very nice.
They used to have a young guy that worked there also from Brazil that I enjoyed working with. Yeah.
Wayne, for those that are not swine nutritionists, can you explain what are the nutrient loadings?
Okay. So a pig has nutrient needs, vitamins, trace minerals, amino acids, energy, calcium and phosphorus, sodium, and those needs are different for the different phases of its life, whether it's gestation or lactation or nursery or grow finish. And so we try to meet those nutrient needs. And so on one side of the formula is the nutrients that this pig needs. And then we look at our ingredients to figure out what is the best way to meet those nutrient needs. And we use computer formulation to do that. And the key to that is having the nutrients correct on those ingredients, because that computer doesn't know what's right or wrong. It's trying to help you figure out the best way to meet those nutrient needs. And so if you've got an incorrect loading on one of your ingredients, it doesn't know that. And so it's going to formulate the diet, Right. And the diet may not be correct. I guess I can tell you a couple stories about where I've helped other nutritionists figure out what a nutrient loading problem and what they had a problem. They didn't know it was nutrient loadings until I helped them figure it out. I can tell you a couple stories like that.
Please do.
Okay, so there's a guy doing some diets for a company in Pennsylvania, and he was having a lot of broken bones. And if you looked at his formula, the calcium and phosphorus looked right. But I took his formula and I took the pounds of each ingredient and formulated the diet with the same pounds of ingredients, and I wasn't finding near as much calcium as he was. And so then we went through it ingredient by ingredient and looked at the calcium loadings on that ingredient, and he had a bad number on his wheat mids, and he thought there was a lot of calcium in there. And so I said, well, check your quality control in your analysis, right. And there wasn't that much calcium in there. So that created the problem. So he had a nutrient loading on an ingredient that caused the broken bones because there wasn't as much calcium as he thought.
Right. On the quality control side, when I know there's different philosophies, like, okay, should I monitor the incoming ingredients, but also the finished complete diet? What's your take on that? And then we can jump into the next few experiences.
Next story. Yeah. Okay. I think you need to watch both. Okay. So you need to watch your incoming ingredients because that's what your nutrient loadings come from. But you also got to watch your finished feed because the finished feed will give you a clue how good a job you're doing on your ingredients. But it's also going to help you figure out if you've got how good the mill is at putting those ingredients in. And then there's a third part of it that I think that most people underutilize, and that's your feed mill accounting. For example, let's say I'm monitoring my ingredients for fat, and I'm also monitoring my complete feeds for a fat level. Mm-hmm. Well, let's say both of those are running low. Well, is that because I've got something wrong on my ingredient loadings, or is that because the feed mill has a problem with their metering device? Right. And so I look at my ingredients. I have the guy at the feed mill recalibrate his meters. But the third thing that I do is I talk to feed mill accounting. And they look at how many tons of feed we made, how many tons of fat we should be using. And if we're not using that many tons of fat, it tells us, that helps confirm that we need to look at our metering device. Mm-hmm. So I think feed mill accounting is doesn't get utilized as much as it should. Yeah.
Makes sense. That makes sense. So what else have you seen as far as the nutrient loadings and problems in the field?
There was a large system in Illinois, and their grow finished feed efficiency had gotten worse, and the guy felt that he really hadn't changed anything. And so I said, send me one of your diets, and I took his pounds of each ingredient and I put them in there. And I said, what do you think your threonine ratio is? And he said, whatever the right number is, 62 or something. And I said, well, I'm not finding near that much. Mm-hmm. And so one change he had made, he had gone through and given his phytase some nutrient releases. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, except he'd made a math error on his threonine. Mm-hmm. So he was feeding a lot lower threonine ratio than he thought he was. Hmm. And then I had a guy up in Iowa whose growth had gone down, and he couldn't figure out why. And so I took his diets and reconstructed them, and I wasn't finding near enough tryptophan. And so then we dug into each one of his ingredients, and we found that he had a artificially high tryptophan value on bakery meal, So, mm-hmm. Yeah, it happens,
Mm-hmm. When sometimes we have a minimum in that energy level of the diet, and we don't have a fat or oil available in the diet,
Oh,
you know,
oh yeah.
and then
Yeah,
you're
and then it'll fill with an ingredient like methionine or something.
right,
Yeah. Yeah, that's one thing that's different today than it was 30 or 40 years ago is that you used to be we would send a paper copy of the formula to the feed mill. And there was a guy at the feed mill, usually one of the more experienced guys, uh, that would enter that new formula. And if he saw something different, he'd call you and ask about it. And that was a good thing. And I want to tell you that if someone calls you and questions a formula, even if there's nothing wrong with it, you should thank them profusely
yeah,
because they are, you might be the only guy looking at that formula if that guy isn't. And today that's kind of a problem because there isn't this old guy at the feed mill looking at the formula. It all gets transferred electronically, and so maybe nobody looks at that. And you want people to be looking at it. And so even if there's nothing wrong with the formula, you thank him for looking at it because you want them to be looking at it because it's your last line of defense. It's your safety net. You got to be, and you thank them. And that's the other reason you go to the feed mills is so those guys can put a face with the name and they're not intimidated to call you. They know you. They know that you don't have horns and a tail and that you want to do what's right. So.
right. No, that's a great advice. I like that. Wayne, what are great practices to have good nutrient loadings? What do you do to ensure you minimize any chances of error?
To minimize error. Well, you got to be particular and try to do it when you're not when you're updating ingredients. You try to do it when you're not tired. I try to do it first thing in the morning when your mind is about as good as it's going to be. Right. And I try to do it so early in the morning that you're not going to get any phone calls and interruptions. Right. And then the other thing that I would encourage you to do, Marcio, is network. And so you go to you have another nutritionist that's your friend or an acquaintance, and you say, I'm going to take this many pounds of corn, this many pounds of diet, a soybean meal, and tell me what you get for a lysine level. What do you get for calcium phosphorus level? Right. And another one to kind of check your ratios, amino acid ratios. You can take a diet and say, okay, how many, we're both going to pick a 1% lysine diet, for example. How many pounds of crystalline lysine can you use before another amino acid becomes limiting? And then what is that amino acid? All right. And then how many pounds of that next amino acid comes in before the third limiting amino acid is there? And you can kind of check your ratios, Right. So like when you did your work at K-State, your loadings on ingredients were a little different than mine, and your 20% on tryptophan was more like my 19% on tryptophan, and things like that. But I think you gotta have a friend. You gotta call a friend or an acquaintance, and it's mutually beneficial. It helps you and it can help them too, because I do that a lot. And sometimes we find something that's goofy on my end, and sometimes we find something goofy on their end. And so it's mutually beneficial.
Right. Well, another thing that came to mind, Wayne, is, young nutritionists like myself and others, get into the industry. What would be your recommendation for, say, the first couple of steps? Okay, first day in the job, how do we take over from a nutrient loading standpoint?
Yeah, and I'd say this is true for not just a young nutritionist, but an old nutritionist too, that goes into a new situation. So like when I went to Premium Standard Farms, I didn't start changing diets the first damn thing. I started looking at the nutrient loadings for ingredients because that's what drives it. That computer doesn't know anything. It just knows what you give it. And an example of something that happened there, I had never been anywhere where corn gluten feed was a good buy for pigs. It's a great buy. It's a great ingredient, but it's usually the cattle guys scoop it up, and it's worth more to them. But corn gluten feed was coming into these diets, and so the supplier was ADM, a good quality company, and I visited with their nutritionist, and we went through the nutrient loadings on that ingredient, and the previous nutritionist had what a very optimistic, very very optimistic energy value on that ingredient. I don't know if it was an error or a entry error or I don't know what he was thinking about. But so once I changed that, then corn gluten feed was not a good buy anymore.
Makes sense.
So you got to go through your ingredients, and I think that's the first thing you do in a new setting. And so how do you do that? Well, you can look at NRC, you can call a friend, you can, you got options. Yeah. And then another thing I think a person should try to do on his nutrient loadings is to, like on his VTM or his vitamins and trace minerals and on his drugs or any other additive, probably he needs to spend some time understanding how much calcium's coming from those ingredients, because limestone is a common carrier, and so you'll end up with more calcium than you probably need or want if you don't pay attention. And everybody says, well, the inclusion rate of those is very big, but you start adding them all together and the inclusion rate becomes high. And then on some of these drugs, like I remember I was reviewing some diets for a company, and man, I was coming up with way more calcium in this last nursery diet than they were. And they were using neoteramycin, which is a fine drug, but your inclusion rate of that product was like 40 pounds per ton, and they weren't accounting for the limestone that was in there as a carrier. And the interesting part of that story, I think, Marcio, is that they called me a month or two later and said their exit weights of their nurseries had gone up, and they really hadn't changed anything else. So that excess calcium was hurting them. And I think some of Hans Stein's recent work out of Illinois would confirm that too much calcium can hurt performance.
Right. Makes sense. What have you seen lately that might concern you or you're thinking about?
Yeah, I saw some diets from Brazil, and they're corn soy diets predominantly, and you're very familiar with them, but they were adding choline to those diets. And I don't think it's hurting the pig performance at all, but I would be surprised if they have a need for choline. A grow-finished pig would have a need for choline in a corn soy diet. And I think, Marcio, you did a study with Carthage that showed that they didn't need it.
Right. Yeah, we did.
Right. So and again, that's not going to hurt the pigs, but it's going to hurt somebody's pocketbook.
Right. 100%.
Maybe we could talk about consistent ingredients versus variable ingredients. We should reward consistent ingredients. And one way to reward them or make them more attractive is that on your variable ingredients, because you don't know that nutrient's going to be in there all the time, that you could use your average minus of half a standard deviation or something to make sure you have the right amount of nutrient in there all the time. I think that's a pretty good practice.
That makes sense. Oh, one thing I was going to ask you was on the, monocalcium phosphate and dicalcium phosphate. Some areas I've experienced, some areas of the U.S. and also Canada, some people just call like dical, right? So for us, I guess it's good to always ask for the label, right? Something I learned with you as well.
Yeah, ask for the label. And I think a feed mill today probably uses less feed phosphate in a month than they used to use in a week. And so you think about that feed mill and those augers that are putting that into our ton of feed. They are way too large,
Right.
and to put in these small amounts. And so there's some advantage to going to a feed mill and sitting down next to the guy batching the feed and just watching what the heck's going on. Because and then what you need to do is either slow that auger down, or you can put in a smaller auger, which is more expensive, or you can do some things like you can cut off some of the flighting on that auger at the end so it's less efficient and doesn't add it as fast. So you'll see that, we're adding less feed phosphate in a diet. Used to be you'd put in 10 pounds. Well, now maybe not putting in any, but worse yet, we're putting in 1 or 2 pounds. And can it do it accurately?
Right. Some people, I think some people are even adding on the microbin sometimes.
That's right. That's right.
When they have space available.
Yeah.
Very good. Good. Anything else, Wayne, that comes to mind when nutrient loadings?
You ask any of these young nutritionists that have worked with me, and they will tell you that I tell them every day nutrient loadings are everything. This computer formulation is wonderful, but those elves in there that are doing those thousands of calculations, they don't know if you're giving them bad information. And I would encourage people to compare ingredients with other nutritionists and formulation with other nutritionists, where you put in pound for pound a match a diet and see how different the answers are. Right. And there's going to be some frustrations with that process too. In that, like Gary Cromwell did a study on soybean meal, and he took soybean meal from 5 or 6 different plants, and he sent it to 5 or 6 different labs for amino acid analysis. And he found out there was more difference in between the labs than there was the soybean plants. And so there's going to be some frustrations there, and you're not going to agree 100%, but you want to make sure you're not way wrong, like the guy with the threonine loading on his phytase, or the guy with the tryptophan loading on his bakery, or the guy with the calcium loading on his wheat mints. Yeah, I did it today with no, it wasn't today. It was yesterday. I did it yesterday with corn and soybean meal because I was wanting to make sure my isoleucine and valine values were correct. I looked at NRC, and then I checked with another nutritionist, because NRC is very, very, very good. But there can be glitches in NRC too. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you gotta be a little bit anal.
Right. One thing, as far as nutrient loadings, and why I think you are one of the experts on that arena, is that you're probably the most interesting nutritionist I've met as far as interesting ingredients as well, right? So if you can share with us, what are the craziest ingredients you've dealt with?
Well. So fortune cookies. I've figured fortune cookies lately. I've figured peanut butter. I figured potato chips and corn chips lately. Yeah. So I've done those. Candy bars, wow. Lifesavers, those kind of things. Yep.
Amazing. M&Ms and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, M&Ms, peanut M&Ms.
Happy
and peanuts.
Days.
Yeah, Happy peanuts. Days. Yeah.
Very good, Wayne. I guess as we approach the end here, we have 3 questions that we are going to ask every guest, every episode. And the first one is, what is your favorite swine-related book?
Well, I don't have just one, but I want to give you several that I think are really worthwhile.
Nice.
Wilson Pond wrote a book, Swine Production in Temperate and Tropical. That's not right. Wilson Pond wrote a book, swine production in temperate and tropical environments.
Okay.
And that's a really nice book to read. Yep. Another book by Thacker and Kirkwood is Non-Traditional Feed Sources for Use in Swine Production.
Wow.
That's an excellent book too.
Nice.
And then I like Austin Lewis's book. It's actually Austin Lewis and Leith Southern's book, Swine Nutrition, that big blue book.
That blue, yeah.
And then I think there's another book that I would encourage a young nutritionist in particular, any nutritionist to read.
Yeah.
Is the Swine Nutrition Guide that John Patience and Prairie Swine Center put out. It's a good book for a producer too. It is. John asked me one time if I thought it was too simple, and I said no. It was written right at my level, and it's a good book for a lay person as well as a PhD swine nutritionist to read. So those would be 4 books that I would recommend highly.
Very nice. Yes. And what about books unrelated to swine?
Well, there's a book that I think I want you to read because I don't think I got everything out of it that's in there. But there's a book called The Accidental Superpower by Peter Zahan, and it's a real interesting book, and it's about America being blessed geographically, and we have fertile soils and a good transportation system, and no enemies to the north or the south of us, and how we're blessed there. And then it also talks quite a bit about population and how that's changing.
That is very interesting. Last question, Wayne, is what do you think sets apart successful swine professionals?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why? I think they want to have the producer's best interest at heart.
Makes sense.
Sometimes the producer will, that they want to do the right thing for the producer so that guy's kids can go to college, and so that guy is successful as you know how. You want to do the best you can, right? Because people's livelihood depends on it. So this probably isn't going to go on the podcast, but I'll tell you, Marcio, because you're my friend.
Yeah.
But when I go to church on Sunday, I pray that my wife and my children are happy, healthy, and productive. And I pray for myself that I do a good job for my producer, because they, 70% of their 60 or 70% of their cost goes through my fingers. And I know I can't control the price of corn and that, right, but I want to be a good steward with my producer's money. Right. I want to spend his money as wisely as if it were my own.
Well, I think that last part should go on the podcast, Wayne.
Oh, that part. Well, it is. I think in some jobs you could say, well, it's not that important, or it's not. But gosh, these guys are dependent on you, and I take that responsibility seriously. Yeah.
That makes sense, Wayne. I appreciate you sharing that. Thanks, Wayne. I appreciate our time.
Oh, I'm glad to do it, Marcio. You're a fine young man.
Take care.
Yeah, you too.